Good evening, everyone. I'm Devyani Singh, a third year BA LLB student at Manipal Law School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Bangalore Legal Forum. Bangalore Legal Forum is a monthly series of panel discussions to foster the exchange of legal knowledge and encourage meaningful discussions and collaboration between Bangalore's esteemed legal education institutions and the dynamic legal industry. Our aim is to enhance public legal awareness and promote access to insightful legal disclosure. This forum is hosted at the Bangalore International Centre through the collaborative efforts of Manipal Law School, along with School of Law, Christ University, St. Joseph's College of Law, and National Law School of India University. Today, we are honored to have with us an esteemed panel of experts. Our speakers for this evening are Dr. Sarayu Natarajan, Mr. Pranesh Prakash, Mr. Prateek Waghre, and we are delighted to have Mr. Sachin moderating our discussion. Allow me to briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Sarayu is the founder of Aapti Institute. Aapti is a public research institution that examines lived experiences at the intersection of technology and society. And ma'am brings a wealth of experience from management consulting, venture investing program, development and management, and academic research. She holds a PhD from King's College London, a master's in public policy from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and a degree in law from the National School of India, University, Bangalore. Mr. Pranesh Prakash is a co-founder of Centre for Internet and Society, where he served as a policy director until 2018. His significant contributions have been recognized through the Access to Knowledge Fellowship at Yale Law School's Information Society project in 2013. His inclusion in Forbes India Inaugural 30 Under 30 list of young achievers in 2014, and also contributed towards his nomination as an Internet Freedom Fellow by the US government in 2012. He was also an India-US Public Interest Technology Fellow at New America in 2019. Mr. Prateek Waghre, our technologist for today and also an enabler of our very own Manipal Institute of Technology, is a public policy researcher with a background in technology. Most recently, he served as the executive director and policy director at the Internet Freedom Foundation. Prior to his role at Internet Freedom Foundation, he was a technology policy researcher at Takshashila Institution. His research interests lie in the impact of technology on liberal democratic society and spaces, including information ecosystem, state influence, the exploitation of digital spaces, and the evolution of digital rights. Our moderator for today's discussion is Mr. Sachin, an assistant professor at Manipal Law School, Mahe, Bengaluru. Sachin is an international lawyer and public policy expert with over a decade of experience across consulting, academia, and advocacy. His work lies at the intersection of emerging technologies, digital governance, global health, international environment, and life sciences, including leading subjects of global health, IPR. We extend our sincere thanks to each of our distinguished panelists for joining us today. We are all truly eager to hear your insights and look forward to an engaging discussion. At last, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Sarayu S. Thomas, Director of Manipal Law School, and Ms. Amulya Purushottam. It's their visionary initiative that brought this event to a fruition and gathered our distinguished panelists for what promises to be an insightful discussion. Thank you once again for joining us with this evening, and enjoy this enriching discussion.
Devyani, right? Thank you, Devyani, for the very generous introduction. So today's topic is interesting. It's free speech and internet regulation in India, and what a day to have this conversation. We all woke up to like some very disappointing news, shattering news in terms of the Pahalgam incident. There has been a spread of a lot of hate speech against religious minorities, targeting religious minorities. There's been a lot of misinformation, disinformation which is spreading. So this topic's relevance is huge, especially today. So today's conversation with this exceptional panel is to explore ongoing discussions around what free speech means, how can institutions balance between safeguarding free speech but also to counter some of the challenges like hate speech and disinformation, and also to have a look at the regulatory landscape that shapes what free speech means for us, right? So before we go into discussions around, specific discussions around these topics, I think I want to start asking this question: are we a free speech country? So today, I was having a conversation with Prateek on this. There was a survey by Future of Free Speech, which ranked India 24th out of 33 countries which participated in that survey, relating to the question of support of free speech. And 37% of the participants from India was of the opinion that the government has the power to censor any sort of criticism against government policies. Is public opinion in India regarding free speech concerning? Are we a free speech country? What is your take on it? Let's start from that discussion.
First of all, thank you. Thanks, Sarasu ma'am and Amulya for creating this space. I think I look forward to seeing more of these talks. I think this is a wonderful space that Bangalore has been so sorely missing. So it's wonderful to be here. I saw the questions that you had sent earlier on in the day, and I went and looked at the report because while I'm a lawyer, very much lapsed, I'm also a social scientist. So I went to see what kind of questions were asked, what the sample sizes were, what the methodology was, etc. So I would be careful in terms of extending too much from what it says. And there's a lot of nuance because this is about government policies. When you talk about hate speech or things that might incite enmity, I think there are a few other questions within the same framework. The answers are very different, which is that more people think that the government should regulate speech depending on what the question is. So there is nuance even within it. But having said all of that, I think paying attention to the way the survey was done is also relevant. I don't know if there's a yes or no answer to, is India a free speech country? What I can say with certainty is that there is a legal framework that enables free speech. There is also a legal framework that enables the curtailment of free speech, which has been applied in complicated ways over the last few decades of our democracy. So is there a yes-no answer? I don't think one can answer that. But what I do think we can say in terms of any kind of evaluation, and I like to set up the problem maybe, in terms of the question around free speech, is that we have to pay attention to the way technology enables some of these both violations as well as the both the violations of sort of the notion of free speech or can enable and enable access to various communities, individuals, etc., to be able to exercise their right to speech. And we can dig into that later, but I'm sorry that I don't have a yes-no answer, but I do think that there are concerning assaults on free speech and that these take various forms, but happy to discuss that over the course of this conversation.
Thanks. I'd like to first off echo the gratitude, the words of gratitude that Sarayu just made. Thank you for organizing this. I really hope to see many more such Bangalore Legal Forum hosted events, and thank you for having me at this event. As to whether we are a free speech country, in various surveys that I've come across, whose methodologies I haven't looked into, I've read that majorities even in India would support a dictatorship if that was necessary. Now, does that make us less of a democracy? In some ways, yes, because democracy, a free speech country, isn't just what's there in law. It isn't just what's there in ongoing practices at a legal level, at a political level, and so on. But it's also what's there at a cultural level. And free speech culture is something that we really are lacking. Now, free speech culture isn't something that arises automatically overnight. What we know of as, for instance, what some folks might consider very extremist free speech culture in the US isn't something that happened overnight. Yes, from the founding of the United States as a country, there was something of a free speech culture, which Tocqueville spoke about in Democracy in America way back in the 1830s. But at that point, he warned about the tyranny of the majority, because his view was, yes, there are some protections against the state impinging upon your rights, but there isn't sufficient protection in the United States against society impinging upon your rights. And that isn't a legal right that society would impinge upon, but culturally you could be silenced. And that's something to be very concerned about. At the same time, as the heckler's veto, tyranny of the minority, if you might. So we need to avoid both tyranny of the majority and tyranny of the minority, where a few people in society, just because they, for instance, when a book is published, such as the Satanic Verses, or such as James Lane's book Shivaji, a Hindu King in Islamic India, that people take it upon themselves to go out and commit violence, regardless of the faith that they belong to, because they take umbrage to usually the supposed contents of the book, because the protests happened even before the books were released in India. So not very much of a chance of people having read it, right? And so we need to be wary of the heckler's veto, the tyranny of the minority as well. And we also should realize that there is a feedback loop between culture and the law. Now, for all the reputation that the US First Amendment has, and very many people in India have first, folks think about laws such as the First Amendment and DMCA as things that are applicable worldwide, because they go online and these are the things that they read about, and they don't know as much about the Indian Constitution, what the Indian First Amendment to India's Constitution was, and so on and so forth. So that I find interesting. So no, the US First Amendment isn't worldwide, even though many of the companies that operate worldwide are American. But and there's been a lot of fruitful discussion about the contrast between the American First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech and expression and freedom of religion and so on, and the Indian First Amendment, which many people, in my opinion, wrongly read as simply an amendment brought about to curtail speech. I believe that the Indian First Amendment brought about by Parliament after the government lost a few free speech cases is actually complicated. Yes, it did worsen the situation for free speech in India, but it also brought in extrajudicial scrutiny by bringing in the reasonable restrictions framework, and so invited judicial scrutiny at the same time as rebuffing it. So it's more complicated, and as students of law, I think special attention should be paid for those of you who are law students here. The point I was getting to, sorry, I got a bit sidetracked into the First Amendment, is that there are numerous cases in the US also where the government regulated speech. For instance, people saying, people protesting against a mandatory draft into the military, and the Supreme Court upheld the government law and the government's views on how that kind of treasonous activity should not be allowed. It's only eventually, over decades, and this was, so the US Supreme Court hadn't until more than 120 years after the existence of the US government, the US state, had not struck down any US law on the basis of the First Amendment. In India, the very first year of our republic, the Supreme Court struck down laws on the basis of the Indian Constitution and the right to free speech. And it's only slowly over decades that in the US a free speech culture was brought about. And I think slowly in India, we are also, thanks to the internet, getting there. But we have to, while bringing about that free speech culture, beware both of the tyranny of the majority and the minority. Sorry for this long-winded answer, but there you go.
Thanks. I'll just pick up some disparate pieces from what both Sarayu and Pranesh said, and again, it's not a yes and no question. Are we a free speech society or not? I think it depends. Maybe in which part of Bangalore you go to ask the question, you'll get different answers, right? But just on the report itself, I think it was interesting, and Sarayu, you sort of mentioned this that, and I looked at some of the numbers, right? So the one you said was 37%. In terms of the government, whether you can actually criticize government, right? But it actually got more interesting when you looked at some of the other ones, which is, can you say something about minorities, right? That was in the mid-50s. People actually wanted the government to step in. Can you say something about my religion, right? Again in the mid-50s. Should you say something about the national flag in the mid-60s there, right? Support for homosexual relations, 46%, nearly half wanted the government to do something about people being able to say things about that, right? So I found that a little interesting, little concerning, but I think taking Sarayu's point that we shouldn't read too much into it. It's more indicative rather than absolute. But this trend is consistent, right? And as Pranesh mentioned, if you look at a number of surveys, we tend to index very highly towards government intervention, right? And you've even seen it in normal conversations. Like the moment a social situation becomes a little complex, we're like, hey, the government should come and regulate this, right? There is a culture of looking to a higher authority to come in and intervene the moment it gets a little complicated, right? And that flows down into why we have such struggle with the free speech culture as such, right? As Pranesh was saying, and I think we've all experienced this in school growing up, right? Don't ask too many questions, right? That's right there, right? You from a very early part in your life, right? We're told that look, probably shouldn't be asking too many questions. You shouldn't question authority beyond the point, right? And so there's some other reports that also did this. So I think sometime last year there was a report by the Alliance for Democracies, which looked at answer the question of how much do you think you have democracy in your country, right? And to borrow philosopher Kant, the Indian philosopher Kant, right, about quarter of them said we have too much democracy in the country, and a quarter said we have too little democracy, right? So it's kind of split, and that I think that goes into the point of it's also very partisan the way we look at it today, right? Depending on who's saying something, we will actually go out and try to defend whether they can say it or not. Very interesting example, and I'm amazed I'm still speaking about beer biceps this late into the year. But again, it was telling, right? Because you had a lot of people coming out and saying that, look, he sort of soft aligned himself, with the majoritarian, with the majoritarian side of things. So we don't necessarily need to protect his speech, right? And I think that's a problematic way of looking at it, because why are we protecting free speech, right? Is it purely because it's a value, right? Is it because it's a means to an end for a more equitable society? I don't know if we've actually answered those questions within ourselves, right? But then these kind of responses are indicative of we tend to look at this a little bit through a partisan lens, which is not the way I would be looking at it.
So that was the first question, was basically to set the agenda of the conversation, whether free speech is a value that we need to aspire for. I guess I think that brings me to the next question, is like, how does the Indian legal landscape compare to the international human rights standards when it comes to free speech? And I think this is Pranesh's expertise.
My wheelhouse, yes. The answer is it's a mixed bag. Now, many people will point to some reports on freedom on the net, and there's the Freedom House report, and so on. See how India is very near the bottom, and I think those are quite ridiculous reports. Very honestly, we are nowhere near the bottom. You just need to go out to and attend conferences in other countries and see how things are, if anything, much worse in other countries than things are in India. Are things rosy in India? Absolutely not. And I would be the first, and I've been not only the first, but I've been saying this for many, many years. My foray into some of this work, it traces back to 2009, December. And I put out a blog post in 2010 2010 January, saying that Section 66A of the Information Technology Act, which, as most of you would know, has been struck down by the Supreme Court of India in the Shreya Singhal case. I said it's absolutely unconstitutional, that it ought to be struck down in 2010 when I looked at the amendments that had just been passed in Parliament. Now, something like Section 66A violates the Indian Constitution itself. But what about laws that have been held not to violate the Indian Constitution? How do those stack up? Section 69A of the Information Technology Act. That law allows for the blocking of websites and blocking of any kind of resource, actually. It doesn't talk about websites, but it talks about blocking of network resources. And that law was upheld by the Supreme Court in the Shreya Singhal judgment. And I think the Supreme Court was wrong. If you look at it from the lens of international human rights law, then there are many aspects of 69A which just don't pass muster. So first, we should ask questions like, what does the law allow you to block? Is it for legitimate aims and so on? Is there legality? And the legality is actually linked to a question of legitimate aims. And the answer is that most of the grounds provided in Article 19(2) of the Indian Constitution are just copy-pasted into Section 69A. So the grounds on which which allow the lawmakers, the parliament, the legislature to legislate reasonable restrictions for those grounds have now been passed by the legislature directly to the executive to judge. So there is no legislating happening. You are providing way too much freedom to the executive to decide what falls within the term public order, for example. The legislature's job is to help define those things. So for public order, for reasons of public order, they're allowed to legislate restrictions on free speech. They can't just wholesale pass those on, except in an older case of the Supreme Court dating back to the 1970s, the Supreme Court held that yes, they can. Okay, that doesn't by itself lead to vagueness. And so from there on, I believe that it isn't a new phenomenon of the Supreme Court going wrong on this, but it's an old phenomenon where excessive delegation of legislative power and vagueness hasn't been called out by the Supreme Court. So there are many problems with how the Supreme Court has viewed the law. And this, for instance, would not pass muster when it comes to international human rights standards. It wouldn't pass muster also because transparency is an inherent aspect. And the rules for 69A, they actually require that what you're blocking, what the government is blocking, not be revealed. Now that's a clear problem. The government can't ban a book without telling you what book it's banning, but the government has blocked tens of thousands of websites without telling you why what it's blocked, without providing a single reason, without providing any kind of reasoned judgment, without any transparency. And not only is the government not providing it, it prohibits others, like ISPs, from providing such transparency, from putting out the orders that they receive from the government. And I've seen these orders, and I've actually, in my former life, when I was with the Centre for Internet and Society, I've leaked a large number of these orders which I've received from ISPs. And on these block lists, you'd see everything from GitHub to, in one case, even Google Docs was blocked accidentally by the Bombay High Court. Now, it is to ensure that these kinds of ridiculous blocks don't happen that you need transparency. If I hadn't put that list online, and this happened the same day that the list came out, it wouldn't have been reversed within 3 days without the blocks actually having taken effect. And in some cases, actually, some of the ISPs had started blocking GitHub already, but it didn't take down large parts of what we access because there was some amount of limited transparency through activists. Now, that's a problem. If you look at further provisions of whether there are mechanisms for hearing the parties involved, yes, the regulations, the rules actually do provide for such a mechanism, except it is never used. So none of the people whose Twitter accounts are blocked are ever sent a notice by the government before their account is blocked. They never have an opportunity to contest the block, even though the regulations actually require it. So when there is no transparency into this process, when you don't even have the actual rules or the actual order of the block, what exactly do you contest? Now, there are some people who contested the banning, the blocking of the internet in Kashmir. And there the government said, when the Supreme Court asked them to produce the orders, they said, no, we can't actually produce all the orders that we passed. I'm pretty sure I wasn't the only one who was a bit shocked by that response. The Supreme Court judges themselves were a bit shocked, and they said, no, these orders must be published. And so at least for internet blocking orders, as separate from website and other kinds of resource blocking orders, we now have some amount of transparency that is required by the Supreme Court. But for a lot of what's being blocked, we just don't have it. And the majority of what's being blocked, believe it or not, as far as I can tell, based on what I've seen and a little bit of guesswork, is actually not even stuff that the government has asked to be blocked, but websites that have been blocked by completely unaccountably using what are called John Doe orders by media companies. They go to a court, they get a John Doe order, they don't submit a list of all the websites that are to be blocked to the court because the court grants them the power to pass on any list they want to an ISP. And in fact, these lists have also had problems because we got these lists also and we published those and saw that very many websites which had nothing to do with piracy were also being blocked. And it's absolutely ridiculous how completely bereft of accountability the system is. And yet these systems of lack of accountability have been put in place by judges who are supposed to be following Article 19(1)(a) and upholding freedom of speech. Now, there are no penalties for wrongful blocking of websites. There are no requirements for restitution. So if there is no time limit, okay, so there is no prescribed time limit because many of these kinds of blocks are time-limited blocks. That is, there is an actual situation of a potential riot and you want to block certain things out of an abundance of caution. And this happened in 2012 in India when there were rumors going around of attacks on minorities from the northeast in Bangalore. and that caused panic, and the government blocked many websites. But the Canadians, the Canadian embassy, and we had some Canadian interns at CIS at that time, they did something more interesting, I thought. Rather than talking about blocks, they actually sent SMSs to our interns and other Canadian nationals in India saying, don't believe these rumors. These are just rumors. They actually worked to quelch these rumors. And the government, not the government, individuals in society, civil society actors, they came together to hold press conferences to say, no, these are just rumors, don't believe them, there's nothing, there's no attack planned or anything of that kind, please don't believe these SMSs that are floating around. What the government did actually made things worse. They blocked websites, including websites from newspapers that were actually saying these are just rumors. They blocked newspaper articles, and they arranged for extra trains for those who were panicking and actually inducing a greater panic. So I just wish that that when we are thinking about responses to free speech, we don't to rumors and disinformation and misinformation and so on, that our actions in response not actually make things worse. And censorship in most situations doesn't actually end up except in the most extreme situations where there's a matchstick being thrown on a powder keg, except in where there's imminent violence. It really does not help. It really does not help, and in fact, allowing people to vent using words is often better than forcing them to vent using other means. And so the government. So all in all, if you look at the kinds of international human rights provided for under the ICCPR, which is a UN convention, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19 in both of these, India does not match up in just this one example of, Section 69A. I've written a whole paper about this, if you want to look into this in more detail.
No, I think, okay. So, focusing on what he said about excessive discretion given to the government authorities, one of the issues working in technology policy is that you will have to work with the government, and all three of you have been working with organizations like Aapti Institute or Centre for Internet and Society and Internet Freedom Foundation. All of them have been the forefront of digital rights work in India. And you'll have to work with the government. And now today's audience is mostly students who aspire to, probably a lot of them want to work in technology policy. So what is your learnings and insights working with the government? How can somebody be effective in influencing public policy in India and guiding the government towards taking the right decision when it comes to protecting free speech?
Thank you for that question, and thanks, Pranesh, for passing on the mic on a very difficult one. But even before I jump into sort of the question around government engagement, and happy to have multiple conversations offline, because it's a complicated beast, as I'm sure the others will testify as well, and one that perhaps is not a short answer. But I'd like to posit maybe the question around government engagement slightly differently, and also start to think a little bit more robustly around the question of tech itself. The government typically is balancing a bunch of competing interests in the context of freedom of speech, which is the broader sort of commitment to freedom of speech from the constitutional lens, concerns around safety and security of its own citizens, etc. But there's also the political aim, which is that every government that is in power is also a political entity, one that is a partisan entity. So there is a party that is seeking re-election either in 1 year or in 3 years or in 5 years, but at some point of time. So there is sometimes the two tussle, and some of the frictions around freedom of speech and information also emerge from this friction that governments themselves face. So that's the first part, and I think we have to always keep that in mind in talking about the role of government, or how do you engage with government. I think there's a second part to it, which is, why is this question now suddenly much more significant? Why is it over the last decade, perhaps a decade and a half, far more significant? And I think we should pause to ponder on the role technology plays. Technology has a bunch of things. Sorry, I've got so many things going on. So technology is something that I think we should problematize a little bit more. And there are sort of three parts to this question. One is, what does technology in and of itself afford? What does it allow? What does the internet allow? What it does is that it allows you to disseminate content or disseminate information, to disseminate pretty much anything with high fidelity and practically zero cost. The infinitesimal cost, the additional cost of dissemination is infinitesimal. It's very small. It's one email, it's one file in most instances. So there is something about the affordance of technology that creates a friction with the idea of free speech, or what speech should be there, how quickly is it perceived, read, etc. The traditional universe, so to speak, had very many frictions. So the government is also in a certain way grappling with that tension or that friction. I think there is also the additional layer that platforms and their specific affordances also that needs to be considered, which is that some tend to mimic the public square, which means you can go out and say, and pretty much anybody with zero restrictions can read it. There are others that create different kinds of frictions. You can only send 5 messages on WhatsApp, which I don't know if it's a limitation, but you can, and then there are other platforms that have different kinds of affordances to speech, right? So you, both in terms of the ability to put stuff up there and the ability for it to be read, perceived, understood. So there is something that technology is doing in the way that we have traditionally understood notions of speech and notions of regulations on speech. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that what technology does, and this is the wonderful thing, we've done a lot of work on citizenship and communities and organizations being able to use technology to reach out to communities, affected or interested communities in all parts of the country, all parts of the world. And that's one of the peculiar affordances of digital technology, which historically did not exist. So you could be a person, forget community rights. My son does Rubik's cube solving, and he has a community of Cuba friends from all around the world, which wouldn't have happened, 20 years ago, I suppose, or if I had an interest in cubing when I was young enough. So there's something that it does, which is that it allows communities, particularly marginalized ones, to communicate in ways that they could not have communicated before. And this is something that the state needs to consider in the way it thinks about regulation, in the way it thinks about speech. I think there's a third additional component which has become much more significant, particularly over the last 2 years, though some would argue it's a longer story coming, which is generative AI. What it does is, so platforms and the internet allowed you to disseminate, but it did not make it easier to create. Or it did, but not significantly. You still had a lot of effort. Generative AI reduces the costs of creating additional content to practically zero. I mean, of course, the trick here is that there are environmental costs and there are human costs because labor is involved in making this AI, etc. But the visible cost of it is practically zero. And technology creates these particular lack of friction contexts, which makes the question of freedom of speech, questions around governing speech, governing even what misinformation, disinformation mean, particularly complex. And this is what government grapples with. So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if there's even a right answer on how to regulate freedom of speech, let alone convincing the government of it. But I do think that one, in order to sort of start to think about the way government should think about regulating speech, is to understand some of these sort of conflicting pulls that exist in this domain. But I'll pause here and I hope to come back, but I think that for us to have some of this sense around the multiple sort of dynamics, both of the state itself and the government in that sense, and the nature of speech in the modern or the contemporary era is what we should also talk about it. So I'll pause here and hand over to Prateek, who will probably be able to give you a more precise answer to the question.
Well, actually not, but thank you, sir. I think you highlighted the the challenges that the government has, because look, this is a complex question, right? I don't think there's any taking away from that, right? It's a complex question. The governments are struggling. Platforms are probably not the right people to be regulating this either. Right? So then there's this whole thing of, okay, what are the right answers? How do we do it? That said, let me come back to my own experience, right? Our own experience with the government. Now, again, I think most of this is over the last couple of years, and then being a largely publicly adversarial organization, it meant that we didn't get into anything that was a closed door meeting, right? So how can I really tell you how different actors in the government are thinking about it? None of them have directly told me how they're thinking about it, right? Because we just wouldn't get into those meetings, or we would be not allowed into those meetings. There was actually a Digital India bill consultation in Bangalore that happened a couple of years ago, and I had to gate crash my way into it, where I actually politely threatened to tweet about the fact that I'm not being allowed in, and then I was allowed in with a polite handshake.
I just quietly snuck in.
Well, I wasn't able to politely sneak in, but with a polite handshake, saying, this is a new thing, let's have a new beginning, etc. Right? But so that said, I think while it is a complicated question, I think the challenge is that our governments are not really looking to address this the right way. Right? I've given a union government example, but they're not the only actors here. Right? Because if you look across the country, if you look at the way state governments are acting on some of this, it's bad. In fact, unfortunately, it's probably worse. Right? If you look at the way the Karnataka fact-checking unit came up, MeitY was more consultative than them, and that's a very, very low bar to fail. Right? Same with Tamil Nadu. Right? And then you have a lot of them investing significantly in social media monitoring units, right? Which all have a law enforcement component to it, right? And most of them are not getting the kind of attention that they should. And then this is where I went back to earlier, was about the partisan aspects of it, right? That these bodies then act in a partisan way, in the sense that, look, if you're in Telangana, you're probably going after someone who supports BRS or BJP, etc., right? And then you don't really have the same, civil society is then not consistent, not always, or not consistent enough in how it's speaking out, right? But unfortunately, the way all our governments are, all political actors are approaching this problem today is one that worries me significantly, because it's more from the perspective of they're not looking to understand the problem and understand it and do it in a way that quote unquote maximizes the benefits and minimizes the harms. They're just looking at it from the perspective of, hey, how do we enforce more control? Right? At least that's my sense of it. That seems to be what I'm inferring from their own actions.
Just, I actually don't think I'll speak so much about the CI's experience. I'll just add on one small point, which is personal. I strongly believe that there is a role both for those who are sitting inside the closed room trying to forge a compromise, and for those who are outside waving placards and refusing to compromise and seeking what I sometimes honestly feel are extremist positions. But I think the activism and the careful legal drafting, those who are helping shape things through working with the government, both are absolutely necessary. And this applies not just to government, but even those companies that you sometimes feel are evil and are doing a lot of harm and are censoring speech and so on. You need folks who are protesting against them, and folks who are in the inside trying to make things better, whether by invitation, by being an employee, or being an outsider who's trying to bring about some change, right? So both are needed. And the other small point I'd add here out of personal experiences, as someone who has for a long time been a researcher activist, a hyphenated career, one leg dangling everywhere, it's been quite disheartening oftentimes to say, okay, I'm doing this work for a long time, but I don't see any change happening. I don't see any benefits of what I'm doing. It's very disheartening. And I think that's because there's a negativity bias also. Yes, there's a lot that doesn't happen, but you do have positive impacts. For example, there's some discussion I had with an official in what was then DEITY, the Department of Electronics and Information Technology, and I realized in the course of our conversation that he, who had passed a particular regulation relating to intermediary liability, did not realize that the way the regulation had been drafted allowed not just the government to demand intermediaries remove contents, but allowed anyone to demand that. And we at CIS indeed went on to engage in some research, action research you could call it, where we sent fake, fraudulent, frivolous complaints. And in all except one case, and we sent several of these to different entities, to search engines, to online auction things, and so on. And there's a report where we documented all of this. You can go read it by Rishabh Dara, where what we found was most entities actually overcomplied. Only one said that, no, we won't take down on the basis of your complaint. We said, the kinds of ridiculous things we were asking to be banned were things like things which are harmful to minors is one of the categories that this regulation prohibited or required intermediaries to prohibit, because the government couldn't directly prohibit all of it, but it thought that it could require intermediaries to do it, as though that's not the same thing as the government prohibiting it, right? And we said diapers cause baby rashes oftentimes, and so you should remove advertising for diapers and having diaper products on your website. You should stop selling it. Like all kinds of ridiculous requests. And in 7 out of 8 cases, the entities overcomplied and actually did what we asked them to, but even more, removed even more content that we didn't ask them to, as we realized later. And this conversation, where I pointed out to him that anyone could do this, eventually, 6 years later, led to that particular bit being removed. Of course, it helped that in the intervening period, the Supreme Court also weighed in on this, and they used the kinds of arguments, and our research was presented in the Supreme Court on this very point. So the wheels of activism turn slow, but they eventually do turn a little bit. And so whatever you do, there is some difference, and that's the point. I once had written something on these lines about e-books being easier to ban than physical books in India. And I was strolling, at that I was visiting Chennai, strolling by Besant Nagar beach there, and there were people in V for Vendetta masks that was popularized by Anonymous, the online hacker group at that time, and I was handed a pamphlet, and I said, this looks familiar, and it was a piece that I'd written. Of course, my name wasn't on it, but it was fantastic, right? Eventually, the stuff that you think isn't having any kind of an impact actually does cross the brain-blood barrier of sorts and ends up in street activism without you realizing it. So there is something that eventually results, even if it not now, even if all the effort you put into opposing a law doesn't materialize, and that has happened, it has materialized at times. Nikhil Pava just walked in, and he and I were instrumental in opposing the draft national encryption policy, which was a terrible bit of legislation, of rulemaking at that time. So you do have some small wins occasionally, but things take time. And so just from a personal angle, not really delving into the CI's model of change and so on, but I hope that helps.
One of my first jobs was at Centre for Internet and Society, and it requires a learning process to understand how to do advocacy in a very I guess, radical way, because it was at the spotlight for a lot of controversy at that time. And now, working with the government, I understand it's a very different ball game. And to make a lasting change in technology policy, we'll have to work with the private actors, with the government, and also with a shrinking think tank space in India. As we are speaking, there's hardly much space which is left for think tanks, right? Yeah. As the non-lawyer in our panel, Prateek has been the one who's been most actively writing about law in India relating to free speech. He's been writing a lot on legislative overreach. So what are some of the pressing red flags that you've been observing when it comes to the current legislative proposals that you're seeing, especially the Broadcast Services Regulation Bill and the others? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think that's it's one of those situations where it's red flags all around, right? Even before the broadcasting bill, if you look at the IT rules and the various amendments that have happened to them, it's all been problematic, right? From the way it was first introduced to the amendments, the first set of amendments that changed the nature of obligation on platforms, right? To earlier saying that, look, you have to inform your users not to do X, Y, Z, to say now you have to take reasonable efforts to cause your users not to do it. I'm maybe forgetting the exact language, but so, and none of that was really heavily contested at that point. And then it was used later on by the Minister of State multiple times on Twitter to say, hey, you should not be having this kind of content. It's in the IT rule, right? So there was a flip of in terms of the obligation that's there, right? And then, of course, you had the fact-checking amendments, which in the third set of amendments that happened, which currently have been stayed by the Bombay High Court, but there is a challenge in the Supreme Court impending. We don't know when that will happen, but it's I think government has already challenged it. It's a question of when the proceedings actually happen, and we'll see what happens there, right? There was this specter of this thing called the Digital India Bill for some time, or the Digital India Act, which was this almost this catch-all internet safety based thing that for now seems to be on the back burner. And look, principally I'm not against that in the sense that you try to regulate or legislate, try to regulate with what you have rather than just trying to write up new regulation that you've not really thought through while writing it up, and then you don't really know how to enforce. Right, a lot of caveats there which I won't get into, but principally is trying to make do with what you have is not necessarily a bad way to go about it, right? But then comes the broadcasting bill, right, which is almost, it's good enough for a Netflix series itself, but Netflix wouldn't make the series because of the broadcasting bill, right? But you have and there's a couple of things that have happened there, right? In terms of the only version that we've seen in public was the version that was out in 2023, right? In fact, the version that Hindustan Times reported on in 2024, and even Nikhil had written an article about what the changes were, right? Which the government actually didn't acknowledge back then until I think the Standing Committee Action Taken report, where it seems like they were, whoever went and spoke to the committee actually acknowledged that this bill exists, right? Now there are a couple of things there. Overall the idea of the bill is, look, you're trying to get everything under. You're trying to get cable, satellite, everything under one form of regulation. Okay, principally not such a bad idea, right? But the problem is that the way they've clubbed in internet speech in it, right, seems to be, at least for me, from an element of control, right, rather than actually understanding that it's potentially a different medium. In terms of how it operates, one is broadcast being a push mechanism, while the internet often relying on a pull, right? And you can quibble with the fact that, okay, look, some of them have such a large audience that maybe it's broadcast themselves, and there's probably a discussion to be had there. But in a sense, it's a different model. But the other worrying thing about the broadcasting bill was that, in addition to just going after your curated content platforms, as they're called in the IT rules, and your intermediaries, which are also covered by various things. The intermediaries maybe not so much, but there was this intention to go after individual creators as well, or impose some form of obligations on them, and that's the part that got very worrying. And I think, in our analysis back in 2023, it was problematic already in the sense that we did feel that the way it was drafted, it could have applied to individual creators. I think that became even more apparent in the 2024 version in terms of the way they described the kinds of activities you do, the fact that if you're commenting on current affairs, right? Potentially there could be some concept of a threshold after which these obligations apply, but basically the idea was that if you are beyond a certain, if you have beyond a certain number of users, you will have a certain set of obligations in terms of having to be part of a regulatory mechanism, the potential for fines. You need to have content evaluation committees that are set up, and then again there are various types of fines if you don't comply with these type of things, right? And what you're essentially doing, right, is you're sort of killing the incentive for someone to create, right? And certainly with a rule or with a legislation that has so much executive discretion attached to it, even if when you're creating, you're certainly not going to do something that potentially edgy, potentially critical of the government, right? You're going to play it very safe, right? And just look at I guess, would you rather play it safe or would you rather be risky, right? That's going to be a question on anyone's mind, right? So there is that challenge with the broadcasting bill. Now again, it remains to be seen in what form it will come out for consultation again, but it's one of those things that needs to be opposed. And fortunately, I think when the last time when the draft, where there was the secret draft that was being circulated or that had been shared with certain companies, it was good to see the mobilization that a lot of creators, a lot of people came together to sort of push back on it. What's interesting to me now is that I think the open window may have shifted in terms of there's been almost a positive nudge from the standing committee for it. The Supreme Court, while listening to Ranveer Alabadia's plea on protection from arrest, seems to have gone into a tangent on their issues with what he said and the nature of what he said, and pretty much asked the Attorney General, hey, what's the government doing about it, right? So there's been a shift of the Overton window on that sense, which is even more worrying from my perspective, because will the same form of mobilization now take place, or is it a done deal? But it's one of those things that we need to be very careful about, because it's going to shape incentives very negatively for folks, right? And then just on the flip side, there's another. This is the stick model, right? There's also a carrot element to it. It's interesting if you look at the fact that the government wants to create a fund for creators, right? This is the union government, and a lot of state governments are already doing this. There was some coverage about UP, right? Punjab has one. Karnataka has not one that directly targets influencers, but seems to empanel digital media agencies. Sikkim has one. There are a few others around the country, right, where you're essentially giving payouts to creators for saying positive things about the government, right? So now you're shaping speech in more subtle ways, because you also have to look at the fact that creators most of them aren't really monetizing, right? It's a very, very small percentage on top that's monetizing. So what incentives are you creating there is the other side of this. Correct, right? So you already have disincentives through the legislation loaded with executive discretion, and then you have this again. There's a lot of executive discretion there, right? So it's potentially, so it's red flags all around, right? If I can use a very bad analogy, you're like an Indian woman on a dating app, right? Red flags all around.
You also want to mention the Sarayu portal, the Sarayu censorship portal, or should I?
You can do it.
There's just one other thing that's currently before courts that I think ought to find mention, which is the Sarayu portal, which is a censorship portal created by the government under Section 79. A news article came out yesterday. There have been 130 orders that have been passed on under that portal, through that portal to different intermediaries, different platforms. Now, what's interesting is that portal's been created under Section 79 of the Information Technology Act. As those of you who have had occasion to take a look at it would know, Section 79 is not a provision relating to censorship. It's a provision actually relating to intermediary liability. What it says is, under certain kinds of circumstances, intermediaries, which in an earlier form of this law used to be network service providers, so ISPs, and then later intermediaries are not responsible for what third parties put up. So if there's someone else who's speaking, if there's someone else who's engaged in some conduct that is unlawful, then the person who's actually engaged in unlawful conduct is the person responsible for that unlawful conduct. It's not you as a platform who ought to be held responsible. Now, there are certain kinds of exceptions, one of which is including when you actually get notification from the government saying that here is certain unlawful conduct that is happening. The intermediary can't, of course, decide what is unlawful and what's not. So there has to be something like a court order, something like an order under Section 69A, which actually says that here's stuff to be blocked for these reasons and so on. So it's only when the intermediaries are notified that they have to act. If they don't act, what happens under Section 79? They lose protection from immunity. The law normally provides them immunity, and if they disregard the law, they lose protection from immunity. But that's not a censorship provision. The censorship provision actually is Section 69A. That's the provision that allows you to take actions to ban and censor content. And as I've argued, that goes way too far in the discretion it provides the executive. And it doesn't abide by international human rights standards. But now under Section 79, there's a portal, and one company has challenged it, and that is the portal formerly known as Twitter, X, right? And that has challenged it in the Bangalore High Court. And this also is part of a pattern, I think, which is that usually free speech challenges that come up, or any kind of challenges on privacy and so on in India, have come from foreign companies. They haven't come from Indian companies. And I think that also speaks to the first question of free speech culture in India. Very few, like Mouth Shut, have actually, IMEI, in the Shreya Singhal case, have actually stuck their neck out. But IMEI is also a lot of foreign companies to an extent. So Mouth Shut, there are very few entities that have actually stuck their necks out in opposing what the Indian government has done through legal routes. And that's somewhat interesting as well. But there's a whole lot that's happening on the front of legislation, on the front of governmental practice, which are very censorship-y right now.
Just a quick follow-up question on that. I think you've been mentioning the carrot and stick model for the government has been using to shape speech in India. Do you see instances where journalists, activists, content creators are changing how they are posting content on the internet? Is there behavioral changes that you observe? Is there a culture of self-censorship? I think Pranesh has also been mentioning about selective outrage when it comes to some of those instances. I think a lot of students might be interested in the Kunal Kamra or the beer biceps issue, where being funny, or in some cases being unfunny, is that a crime? I think the students probably have more interest in how what are the factors they have to consider when they post content on the internet.
You want to start?
No, you can start, please.
Okay, so I think this is, the easy answer, the short answer is yes, of course there is concern. There's likely to be, I think twice before saying certain things. I'm sure a lot of people do. A lot of people have said it privately. No one's going to say this publicly. That defeating the purpose, right? There is of course that aspect, right? Because what's happening currently, right? And again, this goes back to, I think we were talking earlier, the disincentives are too high at this point, right? To speak out or to stick your neck out in some way. If you just take the the Kunal Kamra example, right? It was it was an interesting one because they didn't actually go after the video itself, right? You had local political actors going after the venue, right? So we didn't do a content takedown, we did a venue takedown, right? Or at least unofficially, right? And it shut down for a while. It seemed, I think I saw something today that they're considering opening back up, fortunately. But that's sending a very strong signal, right? In terms of what happens when you cross these imaginary boundaries that no one really knows how they're set up, right? So I think it's to be expected that people are going to think twice about what they're saying. I'm biased and say that you shouldn't be on the point, but I think it's natural human instinct to do that, right? There's another aspect to this which we should consider, is that very often we say, okay, look, the way they're reacting will cause Streisand effect, right? And Streisand effect in the sense that the act of trying to either censor some content is actually drawing more attention to it. And I don't think, to a certain point, I don't think some of the actors care about Streisand effect in that particular instance, right? Because you're also sending a long-term signal, right? So yes, maybe that one Kunal Kamra video got more views than it would have, but I think a lot more stand-up comedians who were already thinking, already iffy about doing political comedy are going to continue to do that, right? So it's also a demonstration of capability in a sense, right? So it's important to consider those aspects of it as well. So correct, right? And exactly. So even before he actually cracked whatever joke they accused him of cracking, right? So it's almost policing future speech, right? Or even what he probably was not even going to say, right? And so so you reach a point where what you actually say doesn't even matter, as long as you've created, and this goes back to, I guess, in a way, the tyranny of the majority point, right? That there's almost this myth making that the majority has done, right? And as long as enough people believe that you have crossed or transgressed a boundary, different parts of either the state or state affiliated actors or just informal actions will come at you, right? That's the current model that we have, right? So it's not just internet speech, right? And the consequences are not limited to the internet, right? There's actual physical damage, there's threat of physical violence, or there's or being arrested and things like that. So there is certainly concern. Of course, I think Pranesh will correct me and say we're not probably as bad as a lot of other countries. That said, it's still a worrying precedent, and we want to be pushing back from where we are, right? And I think that's what's important.
Did you want to? Thank you. Sorry.
And I think soon you should go to the audience with your
Yes, would appreciate that.
Something about journalists, by the way.
Perhaps, yeah. Just on the self-censorship question, I think is there a... We have time? Okay. Is there a culture of self-censorship? Perhaps there is. But as I was remarking earlier, I'm at that age where I'm like, perhaps you should think about putting that up on the internet. But jokes apart, I think there is definitely deeper consideration that goes into what people put out there. I think some part of it is the way in which regulation and the state have responded to content and information that's out there. But some of it also comes to what technology can afford and make easier. I think in thinking about self-censorship, I mean, is there a culture? Yes, no, I don't know the answer, but I think there are a couple of things that we need to pay careful attention to in talking about this question. One is that in censorship, or in terms of the consequences of any kind of harmful thing out there, the ability to seek redress is not equally distributed, which is that my ability to seek remedy is not the same as somebody else's in the room. Privilege, power do matter in technology as they do in real life, but technology also has complicated ways of changing the margins of whom it excludes and includes. The elderly, for example, are often at disadvantage in terms of their ability to seek redress. So that's the first, which is that power operates in the tech world as well. Power operates. So there's the social reality in which censorship or self-censorship occurs, which means that perhaps we ought to ask, are people who are marginalized less able to seek remedy, censoring themselves much more? So there is a gradation question that we need to tackle as a society. I think there's a second component of it, which is that harm in what the internet does, or what technology-enabled dissemination does, is that it creates a complicated taxonomy, which is that harm for, let's say, gender minorities, for things that are there, have to be perceived differently from comments about, say, somebody else. So the idea of harm requires a little bit more of grappling, which is, do we need a complicated view of harm? Do we need a differentiated view of harm? I don't know the answer. And the law tends to sort of be absolutist, draw a line, whereas socially, I think it's or socially empirically, is a much more complicated question. And my provocation is, we need to understand if we need a taxonomy. Perhaps we need the taxonomy in order to be able to make the value judgment of how do we respond to it. I think the third thing that we as lawyers, but definitely as social scientists, we definitely need to grapple with is the idea of the absolute lack of friction in creating content. So like the brain to, you called it the brain-blood barrier, but the brain-to-finger barrier is practically non-existent, right? And so for us as a society to contemplate this notion of friction, which I think that we don't spend enough time on it. It's practically costless to put stuff out there. And some of our befuddlement or anxieties around this question of how do you regulate also come from the fact that there is literally nothing so it's like playing a whack-a-mole. So socially, I think we need to grapple with this. So we need value-based, what are we as a society trying to prevent, who are we trying to protect, while guarding against tyrannies of all sorts. We also need to tackle questions of what are we trying to regulate? So self-censorship, maybe yes, maybe no. I definitely think about posting. But some part of it is the state going to come down on me? The other part of it is, who I use my professional network, what are they looking at? Is this really stupid of me to put out there? And so there's a social context to self-censorship as well. And I don't think it's an absolute harm in and of itself. So, I mean, I think, yeah, some complications that we should continue to think about. But over to you, Pranesh.
Because, sorry, you raised the issue of how we look at things differently based on where we sit, and how the law ought to perhaps consider that, what is it that Anatole France said about how the pauper and the rich man are both equally prohibited from sleeping under bridges, or something of that kind, right? So I'll just cite an example. An online gossip blog outed a man as being gay. He hadn't outed himself, and this online gossip blog outed him. Later on, that blog posted a private sex tape that had been recorded by a person. So private sex tape of a woman and a man without their consent. Where these instances, I ask, of ethical journalism, and where it's up to you, would you support the rights of this gossip blog to engage in these kinds of activities? Should they have been sued? Should they have paid heavy damages? Now, a reporter for the New York Times, who wrote a book about this online gossip blog, which was called Gawker, which no longer exists as it happens, was absolutely in favor of this blog, right? Now, why was he in favor of this blog? Because the people that the blog went after were people that he thought had too much power, were a billionaire, Peter Thiel, and were people on the right, people like Hulk Hogan, who supported the evil Donald Trump, right? So how could a blog that went after the bad people be doing something bad? Now, this is for me, the idea that we should apply these laws differentially in different situations. Yes, as examples of poverty and so on make make clear, yes, there is differential access, but should we be deferential to gender minorities? I'm not really, and I'm not saying that you're suggesting it, but if someone does take it to mean that jokes that you should only engage in jokes that are punching up and not punching down, and so on and so forth, I'm not sure I would actually agree. I think by treating people differently in those cases and deferentially, you're saying you're being marked out. That you're being marked out for special treatment because you're incapable of taking humor for what it is, and so on. My late friend Rahul Cherian, he used to crack the most bawdy and the worst jokes about disabilities, and I wouldn't want to laugh at his jokes, but I would because they were funny. Yes, I was laughing at jokes about disabilities, but they were so funny, and I don't, even now thinking back, think that I was doing something wrong. And the more I thought about this and the other kinds of similar issues, disability rights is something that I have done some amount of work on, especially on accessibility. The more I've dealt with persons with disabilities, the more I felt that the kind of culture that some activists, even within that community, promote of saying, no, 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 this is not something you should joke about, and so on, I actually don't agree anymore, which I once upon a time did. And I think these questions are complicated. Of course, shame is to some extent good, and fearing what your friends think of your position is to some extent good, but that can very easily lead to the tyranny of the majority that I started speaking out about, and paying special deference to certain minority groups, and everyone is a minority of one at the end of the day, okay, but paying special deference can lead to tyranny of the minority, and we've seen both of these amply in India, outside of India, in the last 5 years or so. We've seen attacks on Salman Rushdie from fanatics on both the left and the right, those who disagreed with the letter he penned on free speech from the left because they thought that letter promoted transphobia, and those that disagree with his books like Satanic Verses from a religious conservative perspective, have both attacked him, and I think that should give us pause for concern, and to say, are we actually in many of these things being a little bit too simplistic in how we approach these questions, and are we actually being principled in how we approach this, rather than paying too much attention to what others might, or the effects of speech, as it were.
Just one point. Sorry, just moving away a little bit from what Pranesh was saying. I think just going back to the self-censorship aspect. Just two quick points that I'll make. I think what we're also seeing now, and there's been some reporting about this, is that companies themselves are, just going back to how it's affecting content creators and influencers, are doing extra background checks and hiring private investigators to actually, before they hire someone, right? There's a bit of that happening, and it seems like there's some form of organization even within the influencer community. Now there's something called the Indian Influencer Governing Council, which I'm really not, I don't think I know enough about it, but whatever I know of it worries me. In the sense that they've gone out and created this voluntary code which talks about content blocking and removal, etc. already, and what sort of direction or what sort of signaling are you sending both to to the larger community of influencers, many of whom are probably not involved in this process, and to the government in terms of how people could respond to any form of legislation. I think those are two aspects as well that are worth thinking through.
And this happened in television as well. Yeah. That TV channels censor more than they needed to.
So Nikhil also wants to add a point on self-censorship. Just engaging with the students for a bit. I think the tyranny of the minority, that's what Pranesh was talking about. Show of hands, like in terms of how you perceive jokes, against probably targeting minorities, or the example that he was giving. What do you think? Do you feel we should not censor jokes which target minorities? Any?
Jokes are actually subjective. It depends on I personally believe that jokes are generally subjective and every person perceives it in a different way. For example, in US, social experiment was held in which a black guy and a white guy, they were dressed in American attire. Sorry. They were dressed in Mexican attire. And they asked Mexicans if they were offended by that, and they were not. But Americans, on the other hand, they were really offended by that act. So this clearly states that jokes are really subjective. It depends on an individual sensitivity, whether you take the joke as a joke or not. For example, Veerdas is a famous comedian. He jokes on a lot of controversial things. I find it very funny. I'm not supposed to laugh in public, but it is funny. He jokes on God as well. God is a very sensitive topic in a religious country or in general. So, like in Voltaire's book, he says, God is a comedian who performs for a people who is afraid to laugh. So I agree with that. Jokes are very subjective.
So we're in a country where something you say will offend at least someone, right? So the right to offend is an integral part of free speech. On self-censorship, let me remind you that Hotstar has still not released an episode that John Oliver did last week tonight on our Prime Minister. Right? That was about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. That is an example of self-censorship. We have had a situation, for example, in case of, you talk to creators in TV studios, for streaming services, and there are legal teams and cultural teams internally that ask them to make changes to scripts, ask them to censor particular thing. One example, for example, one of the creators told me privately was that they had to change the script for a character in a particular scene uttering a cuss word with the Indian flag in the background, saying that might be seen as a violation of the flag code or someone might take offense to that. The amount of censorship that's happening on shows has actually increased dramatically, and even though the broadcast bill was pulled, even though it was never really released, it's increased even more in the last 1 year. All of this began with Tandav, where the Allahabad High Court issued a non-bailable warrant against the content head of Amazon Prime. She had to appear in court. That basically meant that when the IT rules came out, this was Jan 2021, when the IT rules came out in Feb, and it came into effect in June 2021, none of the streaming services opposed that particular clause, saying that even though the IT rules had no jurisdiction over streaming services, none of them opposed it because they were afraid, and they said if an internal regulation mechanism is created, then maybe we won't have that many lawsuits against us, right? Every single player in the streaming industry is saying, which is my hill to die on? And is taking a call on what to push back against and what not to push back against. The same thing happens on social media. If you look at the IT rules again, they expanded the scope of social media regulation substantially. None of the social media platforms challenged any part of that expansion of rules, except Meta, that went to court to challenge against the potential risk to removal of end-to-end encryption. So the social media platform also decided this is not our hill to die on, right? So what happens is there is action that gets taken against one individual or one entity, an example is made of them, regulations come out, and then no one challenges those because they'd rather comply. That's not to say that there aren't teams that go into Section 69A meetings with the government and don't push back. And for a while, we had people there that were amenable to some of these pushbacks, but now it's not. The Sahयोग portal expands the scope and shifts the burden to Section 79A. And the reason why we are opposing 79A is because of this expansion of scope of censorship there. The other thing that I want to remind you of is from a journalism perspective. There are stories that don't get done. There are stories that get reported in print but don't get reported online. There are stories that get reported online but get pulled within a couple of days and nobody notices. There are also instances where journalists are not willing to now look at journalism as a career because of the kind of actions that have been taken against those who stood up. Right? There are brave people who've gone out and built YouTube channels of their own because they've moved away from studios that were censoring them effectively. Right? I'll give you an example of Debayan Roy. He did a story in 2017 about how it was possible to get a Aadhaar enrollment center to create a fake ID, put it and use that to create a fake Aadhaar. He'd already applied for a Aadhaar in his own name the previous day, and that center had offered to make a fake ID because he'd forgotten an ID. He went and got it. Subsequently, the UIDI gave him an Aadhaar in the wrong name, and they filed a lawsuit against him. There was a lawsuit against Rashna Khera for reporting in the Tribune, again on the fact that Aadhaar read-write permissions were being sold for 500 rupees each. Right? So this Debayan is still in court. There was a hearing last week. We are the only publication that reports on this. The case is about whether he should be held liable for violating the Aadhaar Act in the process of reporting. And if he goes down here, you will find that no journalist will report on something, on an illegal activity that is being performed, if reporting on it becomes an illegal activity in itself, for one. But again, you're seeing the Reporters Collective, which was a non-profit organization with some fantastic stories, was raided by for not paying GST, saying how can reporting and journalism be a non-profit activity? So what happens? Journalists will not create non-profits. So there is an attack that's taking place on free speech at multiple levels. You should see Arundeep on Twitter and his handle, and the regular tweets about the kind of censorship that's taking place in movies. Right? Via the censor board. The censor board is not supposed to be a censor board, it's supposed to be a certification board. Even while giving an A certificate for releasing, they give a criteria for censorship. How does that make sense? On that point about, I think pushing back against regulation is actually very easy. When I created the formulation of the Internet Freedom Foundation, the initial plan, the idea behind that was to have 3 different levels. One is research organizations. We were going to act as an enabling framework for them. And what we were going to bring to the table as IFF was community to the table. So the focus that we built as an initial plan was, let's bring people to the party, which was also the premise of the Save the Internet campaign, saying it's difficult for non-profit organizations to do advocacy. We'll build an advocacy, because the Save the Internet campaign was built on bypassing everyone and going straight to the people. The plan was that how about we build communities that will rise up and push back, because one thesis for the campaign that I'd put together in the beginning was votes beat money, right? And so can we bring the votes to the table? Unfortunately, that scale for advocacy has not been there. Once that scale is there, whenever, and you will have noticed this, Prateek, whenever something has an impact in terms of getting mass attention, things get rolled back. So if I can calculate, I can count at least 7 things in the last year and a half that we've managed to roll back or prevent. Broadcast bill, there was a lot of activity because I was pulling people together for that, right? Multiple organizations, etc. Network usage fee we worked on together. There is, I counted 7, I've forgotten some of them, but there are multiple instances where we've, again, the AI policy that came out on Feb 23rd last year, that was rolled back within days, right? So there are instances where things are actually being reversed. So I would not lose hope There are mechanisms to push back. There are some things that will require advocacy, some things that will require going to court. Unfortunately, courts are failing us, in my opinion. Like yesterday, we had a hearing in the Pegasus case after, what, 4 years? If you go back to the other right to privacy case, it took over 700 days for that case to be heard. I mean, one day, Justice Chellameswar, I was in the Supreme Court at that point in time, Justice Chellameswar turns around and says, we need to constitute a 9-judge bench. It took 700 days. It was when it was mentioned again in the Supreme Court, Justice Kehar just turns around and says, okay, we'll do this tomorrow. And I'm thinking, why couldn't we do this earlier? Because by that time, Aadhaar enrollment had gone up to, what, 94%, right? From 73%, 700 days before that. So look, this is the way things work. Even in the Ranveer Alabadia case, the Supreme Court may have criticized the content that he created and then given him relief. But courts also are playing a balancing act. So I would cut them some slack on that because it's all political, unfortunately. I would see what they're doing rather than what they're saying. So I wouldn't really lose hope there.
I think on hope, right, there's a very good saying that I like, right? Hope is a muscle, you need to keep exercising it. And I think that's the point to make.
Yeah, so for student questions.
Yeah, so subject of free speech and internet regulation, is it really safe in India about free speech? Why I'm asking means we know very well, I can tell lot of examples, but in Bangalore we know very well the famous journalist, Gauri Lankesh. So issues, very famous journalist. She also very famous. After we know that shot dead. So it's really safe in India because we don't know, right, whatever he told, right, Pegasus. So government, they are monitoring everything. They are not only whatever we are speaking in internet, communication channel, even they are monitoring in phone also. So the spy, actually the spyware, Pegasus spyware, it's usually work for government. For whatever they are, it's against governments, means they show the information to the government, but whatever the Pegasus spyware, it's targeted to the politicians, I mean opposition politicians, lawyers, activities, and journalists. So that is the case, it's already.
Yeah.
Even sitting ministers are
Yeah, a lot of sitting ministers. Okay, sitting ministers also. So then after the data privacy, it came into the picture, and we have a law, data privacy law. So that is the thing. And one more thing is internet regulations you were telling, right? So internet, there for government, whatever happens in Jammu Kashmir and Manipur, that time no regulation and all, just shut down the internet. After that, maybe we have no regulation, nothing and all. We, as a technical, we have no, we can tell, right, there is no solution, just we restart the system. Like that, government also just shut down. And same thing in Twitter also, government fight for the farmer protest. Just they are fighting to hold, freeze the account or block the account for multiple Twitter accounts. And Twitter initially resist. Initially they told no, because of freedom of speech. But lot of pressure and technical aspects, they blocked. So that is the reason I am asking. It's
Take
free.
A couple of questions together. Is that? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sridhar. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know, this might be a little out there, but I've read some studies that show that there is economic effects for stifling speech. It seems to me that the Kamra case was not just about vandalism of the venue, but also he was deplatformed from Book My Show, right? So I wonder if it's votes and not notes and they won't listen to votes, maybe we make an economic argument and maybe that finds a little more purchase, no?
Votes vote better than economic.
You think so?
Yeah, you just need to be heard.
All right.
Enough of us need to be heard. No, I'm just saying enough of us need to be heard. I don't think it's an economic argument always works.
I remember ma'am talking about how her age is making her not trying to talk about certain things. But I really believe that people are scared to speak up about certain topics because of the consequences that they are facing. if we see how the government is, even if the government, one of the party jokes about another party, it is just turned into a meme. But if a critic goes out and talks about a party, he's sent to jail. So I really believe that the free term added before speech is not valid. Like the country, the people are not having the freedom to talk about or having opinions about anything, especially the government and how the policies are working. If anyone is not having or is not being able to critique what the government is doing, then how are the changes going to happen? How is the country going to make betterment for itself? It is not a question, but it is an opinion that a country claiming that it has free speech does not have one.
Hello, this has been a wonderful session, firstly. And the question I'm about to ask you personally resonates with me a lot. So, you've all spoken about the legal frameworks of free speech. But in a world where platforms, algorithms, and outrage control what we see, are we already past the point of no return? If yes, I would love to hear your take on that. But if not, if you're not already past the point of no return, then what do we do to pull things back? What do we do in our capacity as students? What does our part look like as students or citizens to protect our space for honest and essential but uncomfortable conversations?
How many of you here have heard of Felix Gerald? Hands, show of hands. One person. And one person who might have heard of him but is not sure. And that's because last year when Felix Gerald, who runs a YouTube show, he's a popular YouTuber, does political content as well, has on guests. When he was arrested by the Tamil Nadu police in Gurgaon or Noida, it was, in Noida, it hardly made the news. When Kunal Kamra was facing his issues, when Allahabadia was facing issues, there were op-eds in newspapers, in multiple national newspapers, about their plight and about what the government was doing. But Felix Gerald, my contention is, didn't get the same kind of attention, in part at least, because of which government was going after him for what kinds of content. It was... Exactly, and why didn't you know is my question. Why didn't you know about this? Why didn't Media Nama get to know about something? Why? No. My point is, even those such newspapers such as The Hindu, which is based in Chennai, where this happened, they did not publish an editorial on this case, whereas they did about the Allahabadia case, they did about the Kunal Kamra case.
If we knew about Felix Gerald, we would have written about it. We didn't know.
Yes. And this is when the newspaper, the reportage, they did cover this case. They did mention Felix Gerald getting arrested in Noida and so on in The Hindu, in the News Minute and other such portals. So I do think there is some amount of selectivity in what goes viral, in what kinds of attacks on free speech people perk up and what they don't. And I think part of that is because a seemingly progressive state government is going after its critics, is going after people who, in this particular case, were supposedly making comments demeaning to women, as though that is a criminal offense. And this was a situation where they were talking about, where Felix Gerald didn't make any comment. It was his guest who said that there is a lot of sexual politics in play in the Tamil Nadu police cadre about who gets promoted. That was what discussion landed Felix Gerald, who was conducting the interview, in jail. And I think there is a great deal to be said for what Sarayu was saying in terms of about power differentials, who has the power to fight these cases, who gets noticed and not. Economic freedom goes hand in hand, I would say, with other kinds of political freedoms. So when the government is able to squeeze you through economic means, through quote-unquote tax terrorism, through other kinds of means to make you not be able to use platforms. For instance, WikiLeaks, way back in 2010, I think it was kicked off by Visa and MasterCard and other networks from receiving any donations. They had to resort to things like cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin way back then, in order to get donations. So economic freedoms that way necessarily, I would say, go hand in hand with political freedoms as well, because you can be denied political freedoms by going after your economic freedoms. Platforms, algorithms, and outrage. I'm not quite sure where what it's a point of no return from, but what I will say about this is that many times the analysis that I've seen on these issues has been very simplistic, because people say it's the business model, for instance, but the business models of multiple places where hate and hateful comments is said to propagate are very different. Some which are determined by algorithms, such as X and Facebook and so on. Others where algorithms play no part, such as WhatsApp. And so the business models of all of these, the algorithmic curation that these platforms are supposed to be doing for getting money out of hate and so on, these are very different, and yet you see different patterns of spread of information that I personally don't like, and you probably don't like either, on these networks. So I don't think the analysis, the answer to how and why this is happening, boils down to certain business models of platforms and algorithms. Now, on the outrage, I would just point out that for more than 100 years, people have been making the same kinds of complaints about disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, hate, puerile stuff, gossip about the news media. And if you go back to the 1920s debates between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, you would see the same kinds of debates that we are having today about the accountability or non-accountability of platforms happening in the 1920s in the US. Okay, the same debates around the same kinds of concerns about democracy. How can we have a democracy with this kind of, disinformation going around us and so on? It's the same debates that you see then as well. And outrage, I think, is always very, very selective, very often mediated through power.
Thanks for that. I think the bunch of interesting questions. On the first, votes versus notes, I largely agree with Pranesh. I think there's a admitting the economic argument. My deep preference is to index for the votes part of it, which is that politics is ultimately the point of resistance. There's two parts to the economics argument, just to add to what Pranesh said, which is that depriving you of your economic freedoms might be the way in which you're deprived of your political and social freedoms. But sometimes certain things don't make good economic sense. And then do you deprive? So I struggle with admitting economic arguments, mainly because there is perhaps my own biases, but there is an absolute value to the social and cultural freedoms that we believe in. Poor example.
Votes versus money, my argument was that votes will beat. We were fighting Facebook and telecom operators who had money and had to put money against us. We brought votes to the table. So that was my votes versus money.
No, absolutely. I don't disagree with that viewpoint either. I also think that ultimately the political interest of a government to be re-elected drives very much of policy change. Even the framing and the shaping of the Overton window is driven by a lot of these considerations. So indeed, but the normative question for me is that the moment you admit economic arguments, you might go down the slippery slope of saying, well, it's economically okay or economically inconvenient, and then you cease to make certain moral arguments. Let me give you an example. There's some research that I read around, and I get very irritated with this kind of econometric work, but basically it says that if you have women in forest management committees, they have some 2% difference in the level of forest cover in the area. Now, there are 2-3 parts to it. First is that, what if women did not have that effect? Would you not have women in forest management committees? Second, what if women are like, I don't care, actually cut down the forest because I have to walk 30 miles to get water, right? And then they had a deleterious effect, right? So there is a problem with these kind of economic arguments, and that is not to say sometimes it's very handy and convenient to open doors, because governments do sit and listen when large numbers of their people, particularly in the kind of context that we live in, they do open the door, but we have to be very careful, or at least do so with a certain sense of this is dangerous, but we are playing with fire. So that's the my view on this. The second is, I think there was a very wonderful question on what should we do and where should we go, and I partly agree with Pranesh, but I think as researchers, which is a space I inhabit, as people who are concerned about the world, I think we have to continue to problematize technology, which is, what does it do? What does it do? What affordances does it give? What does it enable? What does it allow? What are the business models that run it? Facebook, in a certain way, choosing to editorialize the Boston bombings, right, meant that it heralded a shift from what they were to what they have in a certain way become. So I think that without problematizing algorithms, without problematizing accountability around these systems, we are not really going to affect significant change. So I don't share the cynicism, but I do think that we need to think a little bit more carefully about technology itself. I think there's a second part to it for me, which is that very often we think about legal frames as lawyers, and I myself am guilty of that. But perhaps the question to ask is, if the law is what it is and society is what it is, can we think about communities, for example, right? So can you build community capacity, which is differentiated right now? Can you help communities be better able to navigate complicated, horrible, oppressive systems, right? Rather than saying, so my point there around differentiated taxonomies is for us to get to the sense of who needs to be empowered, who needs to be supported to navigate structures and frameworks. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. The last one is, I think, we've got to stop conflating harm and offense, right? Harm is very real, it's very substantial, it is dangerous, and it hurts people who are usually most unable to get this. Offense is different, right? And offense can be taken by people who experience harm, or it can be taken by people who don't experience harm, right? So I've laughed at some jokes myself, which I've cringed about later. I've laughed at jokes, so if you think of it as a time series, I've laughed at jokes in the past, and I'm like, now, why did I find that funny? This show, Friends, I don't know if, maybe it's a generational barrier, but some of it is appalling now when I look at it. I'm like, how can this be? How could I have laughed at some of this stuff? So there is context to humor, but there is sometimes the way in which you think about harm has to be this. So we have to stop conflating the two. I think that taxonomy is about harm. It's not just about taxonomies of offense. But
could I ask a question? The comment made by a political party spokesperson, Nupur Sharma, about the profit of a religion, was that harmful or was that merely offensive? It led eventually to a person being beheaded, another person in Maharashtra being killed. Was that offensive or was that harmful? Where would you place that? That's not a joke. It's not, but it is something that people took offense to. So where would that fall in?
afraid I cannot offer you an absolute answer, but I do think that I would, in the spectrum of offense to harm, I think it falls, when harm has been caused, there is harm. And so it incited acts that arose specifically from that content. I mean, I don't know, I'm happy to be corrected and, yeah, but I would say it's...
Sure.
Excuse me.
So, very clearly, that speech is offensive, but it's not harmful. The actions of the people that were offended, that's what's caused the harm. So I don't see why my speech should be restricted by the government's inability to enforce law and order and protect the rights of those who might be harmed by someone who may have taken offense. So our policing capacity and our lack of policing capacity ends up punishing speech instead of punishing those who have caused a harm. There is a riot or a mob goes on rampage because people feel that impunity, that they can go on a rampage with impunity, right? If that gets shut down before it begins, there won't be any. So I would say it's very, very squarely that, and to that extent, this is where our legal system fails us.
Because the Supreme Court clearly did not view it the same way that you just did, Nikhil. But then the Bombay High Court, many years earlier, in the case involving James Lane, said exactly this to the Maharashtra government. They said, you cannot take the example of a few people taking offense and then ban a book. In that case, it was relating to a book, James Lane's book on Shivaji, and then ban a book because of your inability to control the crowd, because of your inability and your, not just inability, because of your lack of trying to do anything, to engage in law enforcement as you should. You can't use the fact that the Sambhaji Brigade and others went and burnt the Bori library, which contained manuscripts which are ancient and irreplaceable. You can't use that as an excuse to ban a book. It was your job to have controlled the crowds. It was your job to have prevented the resultant harm. And there was nothing incitement in what was said in the book, even though some people did take offense to it. So I think we are out of time. So we will discuss this.
Yeah, no, I'll just keep this quick because I think we're well over time. I think there was some mention of internet shutdown, right? And I think again that's I think what we've seen over the years with unfortunately the internet shutdowns is that it's become this default response, right? Because the state doesn't have the ability to respond to in oftentimes the complicated law and order situation, right? Let's not take that away, or evolving law and order situations. But your default is then to shut down all forms of communication. I think Pranesh sort of covered earlier that when you restrict all forms of communication, you're actually likely to cause more harm in the process, right? You're also cutting off the flow of useful information for people at that point, right? Leading to more chaos, potentially confusion. This also brings in the economic angle, right? Because very often people have tried to make the argument of, look, internet shutdown for these many hours causes this many rupees of loss for so and so chamber of commerce and this and that, right? Which might get the government to listen, but I think it really flattens the impact of what really happens in that in such a scenario, right? And we've seen, I think, different responses. I think after the Anuradha Bhasin judgment in Jammu and Kashmir, they tried to do an allow list temporarily, etc., right? And again, we saw that was a very flawed way of responding to it. Both not understanding how the internet works and just how can some bureaucrat somewhere say, hey, these are the 20 sites that you get access to, and that's it, right? So at many levels, a very problematic way to to respond to, like I said, often what are complex situations, and then you've of course had the problems of these very extended internet restriction, right? Jammu and Kashmir being an example, Manipur being an example. The interesting thing there, right? Sorry. Correct. The first one touched 100 days, right? And I think the interesting thing there is you also see the limitations of rules in these cases, right? Because at some point, I forget exactly when, the temporary suspension of telecom services rules were amended to say that the internet restriction order cannot be for more than 14 days at a time, right? What happened? They just kept renewing it. Right, so you can bring in quote unquote safeguards through rules, but it's also who's implementing it. It is going to play a significant factor in the way they play out. I just want to respond to this last question of whether we are beyond the scale, beyond the point of no return. I think like Pranesh, I'm a little confused of from where we are starting this timeline. But and I think what we need to do there, and just to build off what Sarayu said, is that look, we need to understand the effects of technology. I think we also need to complement that with a better understanding of society, right? Because and then find the index, how much we want to index between the two. Because do you want to focus on algorithms, or do you also want to focus on how society is responding to it? Why does certain types of information or why do certain types of narratives get purchased in society, right? Is it only the algorithms? Is it because we are engaging with it, right? And I think it's important not to separate those two. It of course makes a very difficult research in the process, but I think it's important to tie those questions together, right? And I am someone, I don't think regulation or policy making is going to fix that, right? There's this very lovely line in Rahul Bhatia's book, right? The Identity Project, which is the rule of the land was no match for the hidden rules in men's hearts, right? So you can create whatever legislation you want in terms of, hey, platform need to do this, or you can say this, or you can say that, but unless society is responding to that, unless you're creating the culture, exactly, right, the culture in society to say, okay, look, you should be able to say such things, or you should not say such things because it is actually demeaning, harmful to your fellow citizens, right? Unless you're actually creating that culture, we can write all the laws we want, not going to work, or not going to work beyond the point.
I think I think we're way beyond time. So I want to thank all three panelists, Sarayu, Pranesh, and Prateek, for a wonderful conversation. And I also want to thank Nikhil for joining and some of his very useful insights. And I think the students also had a tremendous time. None of them, were not even winking because they knew they were really interested in this conversation. And that's been very useful. Thank you, Amulya, for running behind and organizing this, and thank you, Professor Sarasu, for facilitating this. Thank you, everyone.